Our next speaker for the evening is, I gotta put my glasses on, Dr. Edward Blum. He's a professor of history at San Diego State University. He's an author, editor, and obviously a speaker. He has spent his career thinking about the relationships among race, religion, and American identity. His 3 books are The Color of Christ, Son of God, and the Saga of Race in America in 2012, W.E.B. Du Bois, American Prophet, 2007, and Reforging the White Republic, Race, Religion, and American Nationalism, 1865 through 1898, published in 2005. They all examine not only the historical processes by which whiteness became associated with godliness, but also the many women and men who have endeavored to tear apart that association. I am excited, again, I guess this word privilege I never use in such a positive way in my everyday work. I'm having an opportunity to use it in a very positive way tonight because I am privileged to introduce him. I just recently subscribed to Christian Century, and I go online every now and then and look through, and he is the editor of a blog on Christian Century called Then and Now. Very, very provocative blog. So I invite you all in your time, in your spare time, to take a look at Dr. Blum's blog. After Dr. Blum speaks, again, I said that we will have a panel discussion, and so I don't want the panelists to choke on their food. We've only given him about 15 minutes, so you got 15 minutes to finish your meal. I'm going to ask you all to come right up. I won't come up and introduce you, so I'm going to introduce you now. Our respondents to Dr. Blum's talk this evening will be, and I hope you all are here, I know most of you, Reverend John, is it Kager or Kager? Cager, Reverend John Cager II, Justice Not Jails, Reverend Joseph Owens Dart, Reverend Lydia Ferrante Roseberry, UUA, CBCO, Lydia, Israel Vargas Gamaliel, and Reverend Michael Ray Matthews Pico. So after a brief pause, after Dr. Blum speaks, please come forward, and we look forward to moderating your responses. And now, friends, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Edward Blum.
So several decades ago, an extraordinarily famous American historian named Perry Miller spoke about America's errand to the wilderness, and he did this at Harvard in the 1950s. And he talked about errand boys that were sent by Britain to the Americas, and that eventually these errand boys would take on their own errand. And the Harvard crowd stood up and gave him an ovation during the Cold War that, yes, we would fight Soviet communism and we would take on this errand. There were literal errand boys in the room that Perry Miller never addressed, never mentioned. These were African American men who waited upon the entirely white congregation of Harvard faculty. And so I refuse to do that tonight, and instead want to thank those here in this building who prepared the food, those who placed it out for us, those who clean up after us. Thank you. Your work matters. It was a tale of 2 crosses. The first was small, made of wood, and had a metallic chain attached to it. As Mr. Bigger Thomas sat in prison, his mother's minister placed it around his neck. Later, as state authorities escorted Mr. Thomas to the scene of the crime he had earlier committed, he saw another cross. This one loomed in the distance. It was large, and it was on fire. Why should they burn a cross? Mr. Thomas wondered. Were white people wanting him to love Jesus too? Mr. Thomas knew not what to make of the 2 symbols. The dissonance was profound. The first small cross made him feel awe and wonder. The second left him feeling fear and panic. On one hand, the crosses were distinct. One was the cross of Christ. The other was the cross of the Ku Klux Klan. But he could not hold the two symbols apart. The flaming symbol overwhelmed and transformed the meaning of the smaller one. Mr. Thomas now felt trapped by his pastor. He felt betrayed. He wanted to lift the cross from his throat and throw it away. The one around his neck now felt like a knife, and it was pointed at his heart. This is what white supremacy has done, does, and will continue to do. It infests all that it nears, and for all the bluff and bluster about wanting the separation of races, white supremacy draws near all that is precious and dear. Novelist Richard Wright gave voice to this through a novel, Native Son, and his main character, Mr. Bigger Thomas, that I imagine many of you have read. I'd just like to do a little show of hands. How many people have read Native Son? Okay, that's wonderful. I was Skyped into a class yesterday at an evangelical college not far from here, to a class of 40 that was reading The Color of Christ, and I asked, how many of you have read Native Son? One hand went up, an African-American woman, and she bears the burden of having to tell the story of African-American literature to her colleagues. If one moves and breathes in the United States, there's no escaping, as Mr. Bigger Thomas did, the infection of white supremacy. Even more, even if one does not or has never moved and breathed in the United States, these people and communities are not immune from the insidious reach of whiteness. With the time I have this evening, I want to discuss how white supremacy and its comrade, the racial designator of whiteness, have powerfully shaped norms of goodness and godliness in the United States. If the racial carceral state, analyzed so brilliantly by Professor Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, is, in her words, like an optical illusion in which the embedded image is impossible to see until its outline is identified. The relationship between whiteness and godliness is so obvious and so omnipresent that it hides in plain sight. It's less a hidden illusion and more a widespread delusion. And this evening, I want us to wonder what connection there is, if any, between the fact that when Americans are asked to close their eyes and imagine a criminal, 90% or more of Americans would see a non-white male. Now imagine Jesus. 90% plus would see a white male. What does Jerusalem have to do with a prison? Whiteness in the United States is a legal, social, cultural, and historical construction that has relied upon religious concepts, the very concepts many of us use. As Richard Wright put it elsewhere, the apex of white racial ideology was reached when it was assumed that white domination was a God-given right. It's not simply that whiteness has become confused with godliness. It has subsumed godliness. Whiteness has made godliness its cloak and its dagger. While never omnipotent, whiteness has come to structure notions of right, morality, goodness, and ultimately virtue and godliness. This association of whiteness and godliness teach Americans from before they can read, before they can talk, what bodies matter, what experiences matter, what histories matter, and what ideas are more meaningful than others. We cry and we wail when towers fall, and we shrug when an HIV epidemic ravages through parts of Africa. The linking of whiteness with godliness sets the precondition for seeing some bodies as worth saving, other bodies as worth destroying, some bodies as worth freeing, some bodies worth shackling, some bodies with beginnings, and other bodies to be extracted until all that is left are endings. we could go on and on with examples. We could go back to the colonial era when British colonists separated Christian baptism from emancipation and allowed white slaveholders to enslave co-religionists and literally have the capacity to brutalize, to rape brothers and sisters in the Lord that they claimed to believe. We could go into the early 19th century and we could look at the ways African Americans were characterized as overly emotive in their religious behaviors, where Native Americans were created savages who could never establish, quote, Christian homes, as President Andrew Jackson put it in his presidential address, of Irish Catholic immigrants as ape-like political pawns of the Vatican, or guess what, of all women as small-brained daughters of Eve who unleashed sin into the world. And of course, of a white Protestant male establishment that was considered rational and thoughtful, fit to rule here and in the hereafter. We don't have to read Howard Zinn to know that the examples are many. I want to call our attention to the era of Mr. Bigger Thomas, that first half of the 20th century, before the war on drugs and the rise of the carceral state. I want us to remember those decades before the modern civil rights movement as we look at the ways the logics and the logistics of whiteness and godliness were made. The early 20th century was a momentous time. The United States gained a literal overseas empire with its military and political interventions in Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico. Hundreds to thousands of Native American children were taken from their homes, sent to boarding schools. Upon arrival, they would have their hair cut, their languages made illegal, and their connections to the rivers and the soil of their homeland severed. We can open newspapers, and for 30 years, every 3 days, read about a lynching, typically of an African American man. Newspapers edited by white Americans. Some scholars say it was a couple thousand. Ida B. Wells Barnett guessed it was above 10,000. I think she's probably more close to right. There's a reason one scholar, Professor Rayford Logan, called this moment, 1880 to 1940, the nadir, the low point in race relations, and not the era of slavery. Those of you who follow our news today may wonder if future historians will simply call our era the nadir 2.0. In this first decade of the 20th century, several armchair theologians built their Christianity explicitly upon whiteness. What you see before you is an image from one of their texts, a book called The Negro, a Beast, or Made in the Image of God. The title was the thesis. In it, Charles Carroll wrote that African Americans, people of color, were not human. They were the literal beasts of the field described in the book of Genesis made before Adam and Eve. So here we have one of the images where the white Adam and the white Eve have, quote, direct line of kinship with God, a direct kinship, right, with God. And in the shadows lurks the created beast of the field, who are people of color. So when we read in lynching narratives about the black beast, that's not purely just kind of trying to create an animalistic sense of African American men, African American people. It's a theological, biblical signifier. Oh, and we lost our picture. That's sad, because I have lots of really good pictures after that. It doesn't look like it's plugged into a battery. Okay, so, if I move it? Oh, it rebooted, so let's see if it works. We'll keep going. You know that picture, and we'll get through some others. Of course, Christianity and the Christian Bible have many beginnings, and whiteness endeavored to claim them all. We know, of course, white supremacy flowed from the in the beginning of Genesis to the in the beginning of the Gospel of John, the incarnation of Jesus. And it's in the early 20th century that we see a radical deployment of Jesus as white grafted into American society. Now, I'm not trying to say Europeans had visions of white Jesuses, things like that, but it's during the early 20th century when Jesus as white explicitly used for racial power was put to work. Do you want to try and get this? Great. Now, part of the making of Jesus as white in the early 20th century was also about making him non-Jewish. One church educator of the era put it this way: why is it that we never think of Christ as a Jew? Because he was more Occidental than Oriental, Western than Middle Eastern, and more cosmopolitan than either, able to take basically the whole world in. Born of a race which has always been characterized by great excitability and volubility, he was made more like the best type of the modern Anglo-Saxon in his perfect self-command, his cool, steady eye, his capacity for reticence, and his love for brevity. So when, professors talk about race as a social construct, it's not just about skin tone, eye color, hair shape. Like self-command, cool, steady eye, capacity for reticence. This is what Anglo-Saxon means to this writer. And the use of Jesus to link whiteness with godliness ran through American culture, and hopefully we'll get the images up because they're really, really neat. In 1915, one went viral. It was Harold Copping's Hope of the World. You've probably actually seen it or a variation of it. It's a Jesus seated in the middle with all the children of the world have come to him. All the children, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And I'm going to show you the image, actually. And you're going to see there's a little white girl who's clothed. There's a child who's clearly supposed to be Asian. There's a child who's supposed to look different racial categories. And then there is an African child who has his back to us, and we don't see his face or her face. He or she is the only unclothed individual as well. And if we get the images up, I'll show you. The artist's white supremacy is so sophisticated that Jesus has his hand on a white girl's shoulder, and you can see fingers on shoulder. And when you look where the African boy or girl is, there's about 2 inches of space between Jesus' foot and the hand of the black child. It's sophisticated, racialized, spiritualized race. One meeting in Tennessee, Copping's Hope of the World hung in a conference room for a meeting kind of similar to this. It was early 20th century. Let's figure out how to solve the race problem as educators come together. And a white teacher had put Copping's Hope of the World up in the background. And an African-American teacher came up to her and studied the picture and asked, why is it that the only one of these children of the world who's not touching Jesus is the little black lad in the foreground? The white teacher, and mind you, this isn't a book written by the white teacher. Okay, this is where this source comes from. The white teacher remembered that such a problem had not presented itself to my mind. And then I replied, honestly, perhaps because your race is one of the most backward of all the races of the children of men. But are you not glad that at last an artist has appeared with a sufficiently worldwide consciousness of what the go ye of the master meant to include even the most backward child race in the hope of the world? Sigh, right? Sigh. But notice the logics and the logistics of this encounter. The white teacher had reportedly never thought about the issue. This is what white privilege allows, that certain people don't have to engage. I don't worry about it when I drive. I don't even know how to be frisked. I don't. I'm reading about it in Alexander's book. I'm like, I think I've seen it in movies. How easy is it for her to never notice? Now, as it moves forward, when confronted, she didn't ask any questions. She didn't engage in a dialogue. She came up with an honest answer. And she moved with racial rather than any form of biblical thoughtfulness. She blamed the victim within the image and the teacher before her eyes, right there. The boy is unclothed, not because a white painter painted him that way, but because that is who black folk were and are, a childlike race. That's this educator's argument. The good white artist should be applauded for having the capacity to view non-white peoples at all as worthwhile of even being pictured. Hooray for you, white artist. You read a book in Black History Month. High five. While the unclothed black child and the contemporary teacher should grow up, literally, and appreciate what the painter has done for them. Oh, great. So we can look at the image here. And real quick, here's the white supremacist theologian, Charles Carroll. Christ, the Son of God. There he is up there. Man was created in the image of God. Is the Negro in the image of God's Son, Christ? So the guy on the right somehow looks more like Jesus and the guy on the left doesn't. White supremacy is complicated. It's often savvy. It's often not very savvy. But just so you know, this isn't an all-boys world. The Virgin Mary and the child Christ. Could the Christ child possibly be the same flesh as the Negro? So we have a young white girl and a caricature, early 20th century caricature of an African-American girl. So whether through the Madonna or through Jesus, this kinship tie in the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning when the Word was made flesh. Now this is Harold Copping's Hope of the World. Because usually when I give these presentations, everyone thinks I'm talking about just fringe white supremacist. This is the most popular produced work of Jesus art before the 1940s. Okay? It is everywhere in churches and Sunday schools. And so we notice the children of the world. And here's the hand, and he has his hand on the Hawaiian young girl as well, but here's the hand on the white girl. And here's the black hand purposefully, clearly, not touching Jesus. Now, we can read this story in some even more fascinating ways too, though. This white educator only thought it was a problem because she was confronted. Even by unnamed African-American educators in this text written by a white woman, we see transcripts of resistance. And it comes from unnamed teachers to the more famous men and women of American history, whether it's Richard Wright, or Ida B. Wells Barnett, or W.E.B. Du Bois, or Harriet Jacobs, or Pauli Murray, or Vine Deloria, or James Cone, or Dolores Williams, or Janet McKenzie, or the list could include many, 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 many of those in this room right here and right now. These are people who've countered whiteness and white supremacy with every means imaginable. They recognized the spiritual and religious importance of whiteness, but came to strikingly different conclusions than Charles Carroll or this white educator. The Du Boises and the Wrights and the Murrays and the Wells Barnetts of the world have looked into the heart of whiteness and found demonic structures that needed to be exorcised. In his brilliant essay, The Souls of White Folk, which no one assigns, from Darkwater, a book written published 16 years after The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois claimed that white supremacy rests upon this assumption, that of all the hues of God, whiteness alone is inherently and obviously better than brownness. This theory leads whites to curious beliefs, that in heaven, maybe in heaven, where all is love, non-white people may one day be born white. Notice the correlation between love and whiteness, that this is the white spiritual fantasy. Du Bois then went on, that's what happens in the hereafter in this white imagination. In the here, whiteness is thought to be the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. No one's amening? For every amen that white supremacy is offered, Du Bois and others have uttered ahems. According to Du Bois, when the assumption is made that whiteness is akin to godliness, the descent to hell is easy. And what I've found as I've gone back and read African-American freedom narratives, they're not slave narratives. When I read African-American liberation theologians, the connection between white supremacy and the structures of white power are deemed not just bad, not just wrong, but demonic. Remember Edward Covey, the slave breaker in Frederick Douglass's narrative? He's snakish, and he lies by inclination, both literally lies on the ground and tells lies. Douglass was a genius narrator. Go back to Harriet Jacobs' autobiography, and she'll refer to the demon slavery over and over again. Henry Box Brown, a former slave who more people know about him, but still not enough. He wrote that it is true in more senses than one that slavery rests on hell. Fast forward past Du Bois, we heard from him already, and when we go to the civil rights era, we hear James Cone maintaining that whiteness is the symbol of the Antichrist. And once again, the artwork can lead the way. This didn't go viral. This is Julius Block's painting the lynching. Julius Block was a New York City Jewish American, and his artwork was displayed in some Great Depression meetings. And here we have a challenge to white supremacist attempts to not only take the Jesus character as white, but also deem the criminal as black. In this case, the African-American man is the Christ figure. The whites look at him. He looks to heaven. Or we can see E. Sims Campbell's I Passed Along This Way. While Harold Copping will subtly, slightly separate black bodies from white sacred bodies in Jesus, here we have the merger of the Christ figure carrying the cross and the lynch victim, one body together. Perhaps the lynch victim is Simon, helping Jesus to bear the cross, pulling him away. There's a lot of different ways to read these images, but one way is certain. African-American artists, Native American storytellers, Jewish American immigrants have done everything they can, generation after generation, to try to tear apart this association of whiteness with godliness. The problem is, these didn't get into churches. White folk didn't mass produce them and send them around and say, put this in your church. We're left with evangelical colleges today where the one African American and the girl and the woman in the class of 40 has to tell her compatriots about Richard Wright's native son, even though I'm sure if I would have asked if any of them had read the Chronicles of Narnia, 35 hands would have gone up, because Aslan really matters. I want to end with beginnings. The typical Christian Bible has loads of beginnings. Genesis has not just one, but two, packed right next to each other. The Gospel of John has the Word made flesh in the beginning. And Richard Wright's native son is replete with beginnings. We get so hung up with endings that we actually are conned into the belief that Mr. Bigger Thomas dies. Go back and read the novel. Never says he dies. The beginnings are fascinating. The book begins with an epigram from Job. Even today is my complaint rebellious. My stroke is heavier than my groaning. Book 1 is titled Fear and jars the reader with an alarm clock. Bring! And I was hearing echoes of that in the earlier presentation with the water being thrown on our faces. After Mr. Thomas is imprisoned, he's confronted with new contested senses of beginning. When his mother's minister visits him, the minister preaches from the biblical beginnings of Genesis. The good pastor starts in the beginning. Later, as the state attorney prods Mr. Thomas to confess to a variety of crimes, he says to Mr. Thomas, listen, start at the beginning. Who was the first woman you ever killed? That, to the state attorney, is Mr. Bigger Thomas's beginning. It matters how we think about beginnings, because how beginnings are structured, whether through white supremacist views of Genesis or Jesus, or in how humans like Mr. Thomas are appropriated or approached as, tell me about the first woman that you killed. Or is he defined as a child of God? Or is he just a suffering black man? These thinkings about beginnings, they expose and drive how we often move throughout the world. It also matters how we think about beginnings today, because this evening and tomorrow constitute hoped-for beginnings that build upon other beginnings that you've all participated in. I'm neither a theologian nor a pastor. I'm neither an activist nor a reformer. I'm a historian, so I spend my days with countless beginnings and often countless endings. But I'm honored to be present with you tonight because I believe that remembering is one piece of how we love those who've been dismembered in our social, cultural, political, and spiritual worlds. I'm honored to be present with you tonight at this beginning because I believe that the process of reminding ourselves that whiteness and its association with godliness has a human-made history, that may help us avoid the myths that it has created about itself as an ultimate beginning. And whenever whiteness, white supremacy, whenever whiteness's human beginning was, let us help in making sure that it has an ending. Thank you.